This is Beyond the Big Screen Podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen Podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. A huge thanks goes out to our frequent guest, Chris. Today's episode is an overview of the genre of professional wrestling. It's a great episode on its own, but it's a great complement to our episode on the 2008 Mickey Rourke film, The Wrestler. The episodes are great individually and even better together. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help others learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can also find us at a2zhistorypage.com. You can contact me there or just send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you again for joining me Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're joined again by Chris to talk about a topic of body slamming proportions. We're going to dive into the history and background of professional wrestling. Professional wrestling has been a staple of the big screen and small screen for decades. It is a theater, a type of ballet, if you will. You could almost say, albeit a version with beer swilling and trash talking. This episode will help us understand and more deeply enjoy our next episode on the 2008 film, The Wrestler. You can enjoy these episodes separately, but they're an excellent pair as a tag team. And I know you're really excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, because I don't think people really understand just how deep wrestling history is and how far back it goes, and how we're only going to be scratching the surface in this episode. But we use this as a template. If you, this sounds interesting. There's, as me and you've been talking about it for weeks, there's so many different roads to go down in terms of wrestling history. So I'm pretty excited to introduce your audience to a bit of wrestling history. We're going to be focusing mainly just on North American wrestling. There's a whole history in Mexico and in Japan and different parts of the world. But in terms of just using this as a primer for the movie The Wrestler, just focusing on North America makes the most sense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing you bring up. The history of wrestling, it goes back much further than I expected it to. And you're breaking it down into 4 major eras. And so why don't we start off with this first most ancient era of professional wrestling?
So basically professional wrestling started off as legitimate matches when it first started in the United States. So it would happen on circuses, carnivals, your local shows or what have you. We're all familiar with amateur wrestling. This is the stuff that you see at the Olympics where you have to pin your guy, and there's Greco-Roman, and then there's freestyle. Greco-Roman wrestling is it's only upper body, where freestyle you can do double leg takedowns or what have you. Professional wrestling at the time period that we're talking about is basically no holds barred. So there's submission holds, there's small joint manipulation, there's blocks, basically a lot of the stuff that you kind of see in kind of modern MMA now. There was no striking per se, but everybody, it was a dirty sport, so people did it. And this actually got really, really, really popular for a while. And it kind of started around, I want to say, I mean, you can go back further, but I would say like wrestling as a sport, professional wrestling as a sport kind of started around the Civil War time era. And it kind of reached its peak before the Great War, basically, with the match between George Hackenschmidt and Frank Gosh. Now, to put it in kind of perspective, just how insane these matches were, their most famous duel, they had 2 of them. Frank Gosh won the match, but it took 2 hours to to beat George Hackenschmidt. And professional wrestling for the longest time was the second sport in the United States. It was just behind baseball. That seems crazy for modern people to really grasp. And it was all I don't want to say it was all legit. The top guys, it was legit matches. But they ended up finding, and this is kind of how it slowly becomes what they call a work or a work shoot, is they found basically, well, we can put on a better show for the audiences if we kind of just drag things out a little bit more, because the guys at the top were so much better. Then there was no middle. It was either you're really good at it or you're just terrible at it. So the guys at the top would beat the guys at the bottom super fast, and there was just it just wasn't entertaining for the audiences. So wrestling promoters or carnival or carnies or what have you would like, hey, we'll give you a little bit extra if you just drag this match out just a little bit. Give the audience a chance of, oh, maybe their local guy has a chance. And that's slowly how it started becoming fake.
It's kind of interesting that this time period, so we're talking about the early 1900s, it seems there's a lot of parallels between professional boxing and professional wrestling.
Yeah, because boxing was slow at that time period, was also slowly making the change to the Queensberry rules. So like you were starting to have gloves on the hands, and it wasn't just bare knuckle, and they started putting time limits on the rounds. And because you would hear about boxing matches at that time too, where these guys are going 30 rounds, 40 rounds, just insane. I don't understand how they were able to do it, especially when you look at modern boxing. The only explanation I can think of is they weren't going as hard. I don't know. With wrestling, it's harder to finish somebody in a sense, because it's more of a dance. If you want a modern comparison to Frank Gosch and George Hackenschmidt, there was an MMA match between Sakuraba, who was a Japanese fighter. He actually came from a professional wrestling background. He fought Royce Gracie, who's famous for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In the UFC. He was in UFC 1, 2, and 3. They had an hour and a half long match. I mean, it was 100% legit. It's just they just couldn't figure out a way to finish each other. And Sakuraba kind of won because Royce got tired. That was basically why the match finished. But so, as crazy as it might sound, that it's not unthinkable. I've watched it myself. I watched the entire match. And that happened not that long ago.
So it's interesting at this point in the history around World War I, professional boxing and professional wrestling are kind of veering off, where professional boxing is becoming more professionalized and more rules based, where the wrestling is kind of going in this theater direction.
Yeah.
What is the next phase of professional wrestling after this?
So people start realizing things aren't on the up and up, right? Especially when people are betting on these matches. It's all fine and dandy if you're, just put a show on for the guys for the lesser matches. But if you're putting hard-earned money down on these matches, you're not telling people, it starts becoming a problem. People start realizing that a lot of these matches are not 100% real. Not that it happened overnight. They were still doing real matches, but they started realizing the showmanship part of it was more profitable. So they started going more and more and more in that direction. And there was a group called the Golden Dust Trio, which they came up with this idea of, well, instead of to go back a moment or what have you, these traveling carnivals would show up to these towns and they would hire local strongmen and local wrestlers to put on these matches. Well, these guys came up with the idea, we're just going to sign these guys and we're going to travel to the carnivals and start putting on shows. So they'd go around the United States or what have you. And they started doing like more elaborate holds. So stuff, suplexes and German suplexes, which, I mean, German suplexes do happen in legitimate wrestling matches. They're just not very common, especially when you start getting into the heavier weight classes, just because the guys are so strong and so heavy. And it starts becoming more and more showmanship. It's not what we would when we think of wrestling now. There's still trying to present it as a legitimate sport. It's still very technical. It's still, the focus is on the wrestling itself, but they're putting on a more pizzazz for the audience. And as it starts losing legitimacy as a real sport.
And it's fading out kind of in that time period between World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
Now, it's kind of interesting. Do people are recognizing this, that it's turning from an actual sport to more of an entertainment? Are they billing it still as legit? Oh, this is a real fight, or are they billing it more as a sports entertainment?
No, they're still billing it as a legit fight. Because like they want to try to keep the mirage that this is real, to get people to the shows. And I mean, I'm sure some more discerning members of the audience would notice this is, I don't know about this, but the goal was to try to present you're doing a legitimate match. But I think smarter people started realizing, like, I don't know if this is if they're really doing this. But the wrestlers tried to make it look real too. So the goal at this point is, yes, this is 100% real. These guys are tough as nails. I mean, and we know from our research, these guys are tough as nails, but these guys are the real deal. And that's how they would draw the audiences, and then they put on a good show.
So then that phase kind of fades out into this third phase, and it's probably the third and the fourth phase, and maybe a fifth phase that we're really going to focus in on. This is kind of I did not know about those earlier parts of wrestling. I put all my chips on the table. I was a boy at one time and certainly watched my share of wrestling. And as a child in the 80s, you could see that a lot of these guys came up in the 60s and the 70s, the really big names in the 80s. You could tell that there was kind of a golden age at this time. What was this next big part of wrestling? Because this kind of sets us up for what we really want to talk about.
Yeah, so you were talking about that in-between period. So you started having different wrestling promotions kind of spring up, and they all had their individual champions. So Georgia would have its champion. I don't know the particulars of the geography exactly at this time period, but New York would have a champion, and so LA would have a champion, and Nevada, and so on and so on and so on. So to try to figure out this problem, all the major promoters came together and they created an organization called the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA, is not a wrestling promotion per se. It's kind of a governing body. So think, I'm sure a lot of your audience, because they probably listen to your other podcasts, think of kind of the Holy Roman Empire, where you'd have the president of the NWA, right? And then all the wrestling promotions kind of underneath him. Now, the president was kind of, I wouldn't say it was just a figurehead the way the emperor was in the Holy Roman Empire, but he didn't have a ton of power. He could only do basically what all the other wrestling promotions agreed to. The reason the NWA came about was wrestling promoters would be, oh, okay, I see this guy, he's working over here, and he's a really good wrestler, and he seems to get a great pop from the crowd. I'd like him to come and work for our promotion. So the NWA basically would facilitate these inter-talent exchanges. And all the major wrestling promoters came together. It's confusing when we have all these different heavyweight champs. Let's just have one NWA heavyweight champ, and we'll all agree on who this guy is going to be. And they'd all have to agree on it, and they'd all have to sign off when a title got changed or what have you. So it was almost kind of how the Holy Roman Empire would run to a degree. I kind of like that analogy because it works. It's very decentralized, where basically the regional groups still had almost all the power, unless one regional promoter wanted to do something, and all the other promoters said, no, we're not doing this. They're basically left with two options: they can leave, or they can just, or we'll wait, and maybe down the road things will change. So in 1948, this is when they officially declared that they'd have a NWA heavyweight champ, and his name was Lou Thez. And basically his job was to go to all these different major promotions and challenge the baby faces or the heels or the top competition in all these different wrestling promotions. And there's tons of them. I mean, I'm from Toronto. There used to be Maple Leaf Wrestling. They used to run out of Maple Leaf Gardens. There's promotions in like particular states. New York had its own promotion, which was the WWF. You had the AWA. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The interesting thing about Lou Thesz was like he would go to these different promotions, but the wrestling promoters didn't want their talent to look too bad. So he'd be doing a wrestling match, and then midway through the match, the promoters would tell their talents, "Hey, if you want to get paid today, make sure you punch that guy in the face a couple of times for real." So you can only imagine you're in a wrestling match where you're completely dependent on this guy because you have to still put on the show, and all of a sudden this guy's, "Oh, I'm going to start punching you in the face for real." And then later in the match, you're going to have to take a suplex from this guy, which requires you like making sure that this guy's just not going to completely pancake you and break your neck. So Lou Thesz was a legitimate tough guy. It was very important that this guy could legitimately work a match in a legitimate fashion. I just thought that was just absolutely crazy.
At this point, then, it's pretty much that these are rigged matches, or they're planned, that there's going to be a specific winner, a specific loser, and a story to be told. Another thing is, so you use the terms heel and baby face, and for people who are not quite as familiar with wrestling, the heel is the bad guy, or the guy we're supposed to root against, and the baby face is the good guy, or the person who we're supposed to be rooting for. And that's an interesting breakdown, because in boxing and in other sports, you have the kind of the person who's the odds-on favorite, then you have the underdog character. But this is something that's really developed into a really full system where you have the really good guy, the baby face, and then the really bad guy, the heel, and they really play up those characters.
Yeah. And I would argue that it's affected every other sport, where you have the babyface champs, the heel champs, where in boxing, that's what Floyd Mayweather did. I can't box the way I did before, so I'm going to start becoming the guy that everybody wants to see lose. And he straight up, just his persona was straight out of wrestling. You see it in MMA, you see it even in football. And for the longest time, everyone wanted to see the New England Patriots lose just because they had just won so many times in a row. But it's at the core of professional wrestling. That's it. You have the good guy and the bad guy, and the bad guy might win a bunch of times, but at the end of it, if the storylines are done properly and the matches are done properly, when the good guy wins, it's euphoria if it's done correctly. And then the next part that really took wrestling off was once it started getting on television. You had a lot of television stations that saw a big opportunity with wrestling because it was cheap programming for the most part. Like the best comparison I can kind of think of is reality TV, because it only takes a couple of cameras. You don't need to hire an entire team of story writers. These people, the studios didn't even have to hire any writers really, because the promoters wrote all the stuff anyways. And it took off crazy, led by wrestlers, Gorgeous George. He was famous for, I'm sure if your audience wants to, you can look him up. He was famous for biting the turnbuckles and ripping them up, and he was anything but gorgeous. He was a very, very unattractive man, and it took off crazy during the 50s and the 60s. But this is considered one of the wrestling's golden ages because it became so popular. Bruno Sammartino was the big wrestler at that time too. But then it led into problems because it became overexposure, where literally every channel, they were playing wrestling all the time, and it just became too much. People got tired of it. I keep on saying that that's going to happen to reality TV, but it doesn't seem that's ever going to be slowing down.
Where did people, Lou Thesz and Gorgeous George and some of these other early wrestlers, where did they come from as far as their background goes? Did they have a Greco-Roman classical wrestling background, or were they just performers and athletes?
I'm not as familiar with Gorgeous George, but I know Luthez was a legitimate wrestler. A lot of these early wrestlers were legitimate tacticians. They had backgrounds in submission arts. They had backgrounds in Greco-Roman wrestling or freestyle wrestling, and catch as catch can, which is submission wrestling, basically. A lot of leg locks, toe holds, neck cranks, which is when you grab an opponent by the back of the neck and basically exactly as it says, just pull the person's neck forward. And it might not seem much, but if you don't know how to defend yourself against that, or if your opponent is pulling you and he's really strong, it will actually restrict your breathing, like extreme amount of pain. You'll see it in MMA. You used to see it in MMA, early in MMA, but the guys are so good now. They know how to kind of roll out of those situations. But most of these guys were legitimate wrestlers, and there was a big belief that if you were going to be the heavyweight champ of the NWA or one of these major promotions, you should be able to actually be a wrestler.
So people, Luthez and the NWA heavyweight champion, they would go to get the crowds excited to come to these smaller promotions that, where were these smaller promotions getting their talent from?
Local people traveling to them. Especially if you got stale in one market, say, I don't know, the crowd just wasn't popping for you anymore. If you wanted to do something different, you could literally just go to the next town over, not quite that, a little bit further than that, and then you could just reinvent yourself as something totally different.
And then these smaller venues or these smaller promotions, they're starting to all coalesce together into the big regional promotions that people are probably a little bit more familiar with. Is this happening when is that starting to happen?
During the 60s and then in the 70s, and that's basically when it starts happening. This is when you start getting the formation of the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, which was created by Vern Gagne, who was a legitimate wrestler. He was on the Olympic teams and what have you, and he was initially part of the NWA, but he had a disagreement. He wanted to have a run as the NWA champ, and the NWA governing body was, no, this isn't going to work for us. So he decided, fine, I'll just leave. And he just left and did his own promotion, the AWA, and created himself as his own champion. He was the first guy to major promotion to leave the umbrella of the NWA. And then you also had Jim Crockett Promotions, which is a famous promotion that was based in the Carolinas. You got people would be familiar with them. This is where the Four Horsemen came from. This is where Ric Flair came from. This is where Magnum TA came from. And then you had another promotion, the WCCW, World Class Championship Wrestling, which was based out of Texas, specifically Dallas, and they're famous for the Von Erich family. And then there was also Memphis Wrestling, which is, I guess people would be most familiar. This is where Jerry the King Lawler came from. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Man on the Moon with about Andy Kaufman and the feud that he had with Jerry the King Lawler, which was a pretty famous feud. When Jerry the King Lawler plays himself in that movie, it's really, really funny. And then the other major promotion, which is, I guess people are most familiar with, is at the time it was called the WWWF, and this was ran by Vince McMahon's dad. And those are the big promotions during the 70s and the early 80s.
And now a brief word from our sponsors. So we have all these different promotions, and I think that that's a really interesting time period in wrestling because it was so decentralized and they were all playing to their individual markets. They all had different focuses. Some are more fighting, bruiser type people just wailing on each other. Some are more high flying. Some are more based around the entertainment. How does this all continue to unfold?
So yeah, the territory system, which is what it's called, basically, it's referred to now. I don't know if they refer to it as that themselves. Everyone just calls it the territory system. It worked really well. For the most part, everybody had their own regional areas that they promoted shows, and everyone was making money. So then Vince McMahon comes around, and he grew up in the wrestling business with his dad. So he was the ring announcer, and he was always around wrestling with his dad, and he always had a love for wrestling. He looked at the territory system, and he saw that he had the foresight to realize this isn't going to last forever. And he had a vision of a big national wrestling promotion that would go across all of United States. And he ended up buying the WWF it was still called at the time, from his dad. He bought all the shareholders out, or what have you. He gave a lot of the Gorilla Monsoon was a shareholder at the time. He gave him a job, and he renamed it the WWF, which is what we're more familiar with. He had a vision that if he could get a national TV deal, which he ended up getting with the USA Network, that the WWF would become the wrestling promotion. So when anybody, doesn't matter where you are, thought of wrestling, the first thing you would think of is the WWF. And he was completely ruthless about how he went about going about this. So he would actually go into, there used to be an unspoken rule with how the territory system worked. You weren't supposed to go into another person's territory and then buy up television stations or buy up TV time slots or go in there and heavily promote shows in another person's territory, because there was an understanding. It's, well, if Jim Crockett Promotions did that in AWA territory, AWA is going to do it in Jim Crockett Promotions. And why would we want to screw this all up? We're all making money. Everyone seems to be doing pretty good. And Vince is, no, I'm going to do away with all of this. So he went into these other territories promoting shows, but more importantly, he bought a lot of television time slots in a lot of these areas. And this sounds crazy now, thinking because of how big it's called the WWE now, but how big it is now. He would actually pay these TV stations to play WWF programming in, say, AWA territory or Memphis territory, or in WCW, WCCW or Jim Crockett territory. And he bought, I think his biggest grab was buying like the TV time slot in the LA region. LA is a big city. And by doing this, across the entire country, people were watching WWF programming. He also saw an opportunity to there used to be an understanding that other promotions would lend talent to each other. And then so Ric Flair would go to Memphis, and Jerry the King Lawler would go to the Carolinas, and one of the Von Erichs would come up to AWA, and then Vern Gagne or one of the wrestlers from the AWA would go down to Texas, and they all shared the talent. And there was an understanding. Everyone benefited from it. Vince saw an opportunity as, well, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to buy their talent and then tell them that they can't, if you sign with me, you can't go to another promotion and work for them. It's ruthless, but it worked. He went around poaching. I don't want to say poaching. He went around buying other promotions' talent. Now, the most famous acquisition was probably when he got Hulk Hogan from the AWA, which there's a whole story with that. The AWA at the time had Hulk Hogan. When people are probably most familiar with the movie Rocky III, where he plays Thunder Lips, and he was a mega star at that time. And Hulk Hogan he basically went to Vern Gagne, said, I'm the most over guy in the company now. I want to be champ. Put the belt on me. I'll make money. You make money. Everyone will be happy. Vern Gagne said, no, he's not doing it. Because Hulk Hogan was not a technical wrestler. He wasn't a real wrestler. He played the brawling bit and played almost like a cartoon character. And Vern Gagne's, nope, it's going to Nick Bockwinkel, who had been around forever at that point. And it just blows my mind that a wrestling promotion would have Hulk Hogan and be like, no, I'm going to walk away from this. So Hulk Hogan had reasons to leave anyway. So Vince signs Hulk Hogan. And I mean, a lot of it is the rest is history. He starts signing all these other guys. And basically built on top of Hulk Hogan, he develops a new way of, I don't want to say it's a new way, just he emphasizes certain aspects of the wrestling show more at the at the detriment to the other aspects of the wrestling show. So this is where you start getting, in Vince's promotion, you start getting the really over the top baby faces and the really over the top heels. It starts becoming very cartoony, and it's done on purpose, because it's the reason they did this was because they were trying to direct it to the kids. They actually had a wrestling TV show. They would make toys so the kids would watch this, and then like they'd bug their parents. Oh, you got to buy me the new Hulk Hogan toy. You got to get me this. You got to get me that. And it was made, so it was all done. So it was very family friendly entertainment. And you can see it with how all the wrestlers at that time period were dressed. Macho Man Randy Savage was very bright colors, very over-the-top character. Hulk Hogan was red and yellow, and most of the emphasis was put on the storyline and the over-the-top gimmicks that these wrestlers were playing, and there was less emphasis put on the actual wrestling part of it. You'd be lucky at this time to seeing a wrestling match go longer than 15 minutes. In the WWE at this time. And now, my opinion, I'm not a big fan of this, but I can understand why this had a mass appeal, especially with the kids. Hulk Hogan, I think Hulk Hogan's good. He does, I mean, there's no arguing it. He played he's one of the best wrestling showmen of all time. But it does take a sharp turn and a more cartoony direction.
I think that Vince McMahon, it's so hard to separate him because he's an integral part of the show, Vince, and he plays, but the behind the scenes Vince was absolutely, he's a brilliant visionary that he saw this industry that he could shape, and he didn't just try something within this paradigm that his dad, that he was born into. It's surprising to me when someone is born into an industry and can see how to basically disrupt it and destroy it, because usually, I mean, he had all the reason in the world to just keep going with things that the way they were going, but he really did disrupt it. But he also played by a lot of the rules that they had played, not treating the talent very well. And he was a guy who was really, he had feet buried in the old way at School of Wrestling and in the new world of wrestling that he was creating. It's brilliant the way he organizationally took down all these smaller promotions and sucked them up into his promotion and turned it into basically a McDonald's, a brand. That none of these had a brand. They were sports, but you really can't call them sports because it's not a real competition. And you're getting into the 60s and the 70s where people are realizing that this isn't really, these technical wrestlers, they're not really fighting for the championship. The champion, we know who the champion's going to be, or Vern Gagne is going to know who the champion's going to be. And him injecting this heavy influence of pure entertainment into it, it's genius.
Well, he basically, everyone knows it's a work, so might as well, why are we pretending? Amplify the showman part of it. And he did a bunch of other little things too. He gave out, to secure top talent, he gave out guaranteed contracts. Nobody else was doing that at the time. Now, he later changed that. And then there's this whole narrative about that's why WCW collapsed, because they were giving out guaranteed contracts. But I mean, Vince was doing that in the 80s. And to be honest with you, if you were wrestling at the time, Vince was paying the best, and that's where you wanted to go. That's how he was able to get all the top talent from around the wrestling world in North America.
I think it's interesting too, because, and we'll see this as we continue, and then especially in the movie The Wrestler, Vince professionalizing it, that it isn't just at the end of the night, here's $50 from the take at the box office, that he's creating a professional organization where people are getting paid on contract to keep them coming to his shows, and you're not just relying on what pool of people are going to show up speaking of the wrestlers, what pool of talent's going to show up on any given Friday night or Saturday night in Milwaukee? He can start putting together a more coherent and cohesive story when he has consistent talent showing up and he knows, okay, we're going to play this out this way.
Yeah. And then that's what basically that's what gave him the huge advantage, is the fact that Vince, he was playing the long game. He saw where things were going in the future, and he didn't care that he might not be making as much money per se as he probably should have. But he saw the long game. WrestleMania is total long game thinking. He saw this is where wrestling is going. And the first couple of WrestleManias, he didn't make a ton of money, but he put so much showmanship in it. He put so much money into it. He put so much pizzazz into it that it became the show for wrestling, and it still is to this day. WrestleMania is still the pinnacle. If you talk to any wrestler nowadays, where do you want to be when you grow up? You want to be holding the heavyweight champ at WrestleMania.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Where did the idea of pay-per-view come in? Because that's a really cutting edge and ahead of its time in a lot of ways form of audience engagement, because you're not completely reliant on TV contracts that were not very lucrative for the promoters. And you're getting past just to who you can pack into an auditorium. You're doing micro marketing. You're spreading it. There's people who want to see this wrestling match that's in Rochester, New York, but you can pay and get people to pay in Tucson or anywhere in the world. Where did that come from as part of wrestling?
To me, it seemed the natural conclusion of it becoming more of a national promotion. So, like I said, if you're watching the show in LA, or you're watching the show in Milwaukee, or you're watching the show in Florida or Charlottesville or anywhere, and you're watching the WWE program and you see this big build up to, Andre the Giant's turned heel and Hulk Hogan's got to come over the biggest, strongest man in the world. Is he going to be able to body slam him or not? Then you live in Dallas. You can't make it to Madison Square Garden to go see the show. So instead of putting it out for free on TV, why don't we make people are willing to pay for it? Let's make them pay for it. And they were more than willing to pay to see Hulk Hogan body slam Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3.
All this commercialization of selling pay-per-view and toys and shirts, is that really Vince's contribution?
Well, I mean, they would sell it. You would sell shirts and stuff at the venues when people would show up there. But in terms of mass doing it, that's all Vince McMahon.
I can see, though, where, and I mean, having participated in it and watching wrestling, that it kind of lost some of its luster. It was a form of entertainment that was very innovative, but it started to lose its power. This whole idea of the good guy and the bad guy and the cartoony aspect of the wrestling, and that the wrestling itself wasn't very interesting. I could see it at the time, and I definitely see it in retrospect that had its day in the sun. What kind of shifts us to the next part of this story of professional wrestling?
Yeah, so a lot of the territories started like, Vince McMahon's legit. He's buying up everything. He's going to put us all out of business. So there was different attempts by different territories to figure out how to combat Vince. And I'm not going to talk about Jim Crockett Promotions was basically the biggest one. Jim Crockett Promotions was based in the Carolinas. It was huge. It was famous. I'm still convinced that if they had done things differently, Jim Crockett Promotions would probably still be there. But they saw Vince expanding, and Jim Crockett Promotions was, we got to do the same thing too. So Jim Crockett Promotions decided we're going to start buying up our own talent. And they were still part of the NWA at the time, but the NWA itself, especially when Vince started going around to the different territories and buying talent or what have you, became, I don't want to say insignificant, but became less and less important. Because once those rules changed, the whole thing kind of collapses. If your handshake deals don't mean anything, then they start falling apart too. So yeah, Jim Crockett he starts buying talent. He starts buying other promotions. He starts putting on his own pay-per-views too. And I would argue that Jim Crockett Promotions was putting on better wrestling shows than the WWF. But the biggest thing that held Jim Crockett Promotions back is, and you pointed this out before, Vince ran the WWF. It was a business. So he had businessmen taking care of business aspects of the wrestling industry, where Jim Crockett Promotions, it was expanding, and I would argue that and even Jim Crockett would have admitted to this too, is that they expanded too quickly and didn't fully grasp exactly what they were doing, because they were still running it. It was a wrestling promotion based in the Carolinas, not a wrestling promotion that was trying to become a national entity. That being said, I would say that Jim Crockett Promotions at this time period was putting on phenomenal wrestling. This is where the Four Horsemen become famous. This is where Ric Flair becomes famous. This is where Magnum TA, Dusty Rhodes, the list goes on. And the matches are incredible. They end up trying to do their own pay-per-views too. The most famous being Starrcade. And this is where Vince McMahon becomes pretty ruthless. So Starrcade was going to be Jim Crockett Promotions. At the time, he starts calling it Jim Crockett presents the NWA, because he was the president at the time. Starrcade, and it was going to be their WrestleMania, basically. And Vince goes to the pay-per-view promotions. Well, if you run Starrcade at the same time that I'm running my pay-per-view, he runs the same pay-per-view on the same day to go head-to-head with them. And he basically threatens, I'm going to pull all WWF programming off if you run Starrcade. And the pay-per-view companies basically having a gun to their head. Basically, okay, fine, we're going to pull Starrcade. But they told Vince, don't ever do this again. But it worked. There was a lot of money that went into that show, and they were never able to really recover. Jim Crockett ended up pulling the same thing on Vince McMahon. I believe it was WrestleMania 6, and did a free show of Clash of the Champions, where it worked too. It was a free show. It affected Vince, but it didn't help Jim Crockett Promotions all that much. And the whole thing behind Clash of the Champions was all the champions were going to fight for the belts on the same nights, and it was going to be free on TBS. But they expanded too quickly. They didn't really fully grasp the business aspect of it. And they did a bunch of silly expenditures. They used to fly around on private jets when they didn't have the money, and rent out limousines. So all different types of limousines. So the Four Horsemen could show up to the wrestling ring, like walking out of a limousine. Just a bunch of silly stuff that ended up costing them later down the road.
So the Jim Crockett, his promotion, he burns out, but there's somebody else there it doesn't just become all WWF. What happened?
No.
What's the next part of that story?
So yeah, Jim Crockett Promotions used to run on the TBS, which was a Turner Broadcasting station. Ted Turner's famous for, creating CNN and becoming independent. He was the visionary of cable. And yeah, he became famous for, he would buy up old TV shows and throw them on TBS and old movies and stuff like that. I honestly think he was Netflix before Netflix, which is basically how Netflix became famous. Except he did it on cable, and he was a big billionaire, and he was a big fan of wrestling. So he used to have Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS, and that actually did really well. And then he started having Jim Crockett Promotions on TBS. And now Jim Crockett Promotions, they were getting burnt out. They're running out of money, basically going bankrupt. Ted Turner basically said, well, I'll give you a second life to a degree. I'm going to buy Jim Crockett Promotions. We're going to call it WCW, and we're going to run it. From my understanding, the agreement was, at first the agreement was Jim Crockett was still going to run the promotion. It was just like Ted owned it, and they were going to use his money. And then that kind of changed pretty quickly. And Ted Turner, not himself personally, but they basically took over, and it became WCW, and they went through various different promoters. But with Ted Turner's money backing it up, it eventually did become a legitimate alternative to the WWF in terms of national exposure and the revenue backing it up.
So I think it's interesting because I think it's hard to really wrap your mind around Ted Turner and what he did. I mean, he basically invented cable in a lot of ways. He's
Yeah.
what really, you said, he was the Netflix of his time, that he was bringing in all these different things. And it really should have been creating gold for Ted Turner to come in and take over your wrestling, because he had unlimited money. He made CNN. He's the guy who invented it, and he should have been able to take WCW and just blow a WWF out of the water.
But the problem is, Ted Turner might have loved wrestling, but he wasn't a wrestling promoter. And he had a bunch of other stuff that he had to worry about too. Where Vince, all he had to worry about was the WWF. That's all he had to worry about. Ted Turner was doing a bunch of other stuff. He always had a connection to wrestling, because wrestling really, when he was just a small time guy, did a lot of good things for him, especially at Georgia Championship Wrestling. So he always had a soft spot for wrestling, and he always liked wrestling. He was a wrestling fan. So they would hire within a corporate structure. They would hire these guys to run a wrestling promotion. End up, a lot of these guys, I think at one point, one guy was, I think he ran the Pizza Hut chains of Pizza Huts or something like that. And this guy was running a wrestling promotion. He didn't know anything about it. What WCW should have done, and they ended up doing it later, but when Ted Turner initially bought it, was try to be an actual alternative to what the WWF was doing. The WWF had cornered the market on kids, cartoony, over the top, gimmicky style wrestling. And what ended up happening was WCW was, okay, well, it worked for the WWF. So WCW decided, well, we're just going to become the WWF. It just didn't work, especially in the South. They didn't want that style of wrestling. They grew up watching Jim Crockett Promotions. They wanted real good wrestling matches that went on for an hour, half an hour, highly technical matches, and sometimes the odd bloodbath here and there. A more serious version of wrestling. And for the longest time, WCW was in this limbo area where they're just, I don't know, they're just trying to copy what made the WWF successful. It didn't work. I mean, they were still the number 2 promotion, but it didn't work for the longest time.
How does it eventually play out between WCW, WWF, between this period in the 90s and the early 2000s that were not a great time for wrestling, a lot by any metric, money wise, and fan draw, that they're just, it really did take a big nosedive from the 80s. What did the 90s, early 2000s look like?
Yeah, so Hulkamania ends up dying down to, I guess, I've heard it said when Hulk Hogan lost to the Ultimate Warrior, I believe it was, I can't remember which WrestleMania it was, but I know it was in Toronto. It was the 80s wrestling era died with it. I mean, and there's some truth to it. But I think there's a bunch of different reasons why it kind of slowly started dying down. I think one reason is these kids started growing up, and they no longer, who grew up like being ultimate wrestling fans, they no longer really, either they just kind of grew out of wrestling, or the ones that kept on being wrestling fans, they didn't want this cartoonish version that Vince was still portraying. Vince also had this belief that if he could make himself just the only wrestling promotion by buying out all his competition or putting his competition out of business, that if you're a wrestling fan, you would just watch the WWF. It didn't matter. That's really not what ended up happening. A lot of fans that were fans of the AWA style of wrestling, some of them went and just started watching the WWF, but a lot of them just stopped watching wrestling, period. Especially in Texas too, and especially in the South, they just stopped watching wrestling. To me, that's a big part. A lot of these regional promotions, they had a very unique style that was very different than the show that the WWF would put on. And Vince, I think he was wrong, thinking that they would just start watching the WWF programming. And then you also, on top of it, you had, like we were talking about earlier, is that WCW decided, the way to compete with Vince was become more the WWF. But a lot of those Southern wrestling fans, or wrestling, as Ted Turner used to say was they didn't want that style of wrestling. If they wanted that style of wrestling, they would have watched the WWF, but they didn't. And they tuned out from WCW too. And they also didn't watch the WWF, and they're basically just waiting for somebody to actually make it do an alternative. And then there was other things that did too that didn't help either. Vince in the late 80s, early 90s was like embroiled in a steroid scandal where I don't know, he was accused of giving steroids to the wrestlers, and from my understanding, nothing much came out of it, but it didn't look good on the sport, especially when you're presenting it to kids. And Vince, you got Hulk Hogan up there telling kids, eat your vitamins and say your prayers and you'll have my 26-inch pythons. I'm sorry, kids, it's not going to happen. You need a little extracurricular activity. And the WWF just failing to reinvent itself in this new reality too. They just figured we'll just keep on doing the same stuff that has always worked, and it didn't. And slowly it just started kind of dying down.
So some other promotions came in, like the ECW that was doing a more extreme version, and WCW and WWF, which during this time period will turn into WWE. They start to adopt these sorts of wrestling, and that gets us into the early 2000s. And going forward into the early 2000s and into now, what does wrestling look like?
Well, yeah, so I would argue the last golden age of wrestling was in the late 90s to the early 2000s. This is when you have Stone Cold, The Rock, and you had three. I don't want to say ECW was a major promotion, but you had promotions, which was the WWF, WWE, ECW, and WCW. WCW kind of reinvented itself, where they effectively started using Ted Turner's money in terms of grabbing talent from other promotions and presenting a different feel to the show. This is where the NWO comes around, and they start doing more realistic kind of matches. WWF responds, and they start doing what they call the Attitude Era. But realistically, both of these promotions kind of stole the ideas from ECW, which was a small indie promotion that it's most famous for its hardcore matches. But they did a bunch of different things. It was just, I don't know, the best I can think of it, it was the equivalent to like a punk movement in wrestling, where they just said, screw all the rules. We're going to try totally different things, and we're going to throw a bunch of stuff on the wall, and we're going to see what sticks. And it was this, and it inspired both these other promotions to do that, to take the same, we'll take the things that worked in ECW and then kind of tone them down for their more mainstream audiences. And eventually the WWF ends up winning this whole competition. And there's actually a very good book that, if your audiences are interested, it's called Nitro, and it's about the kind of the rise and fall of WCW. And there's a bunch of different reasons why WCW didn't work out. People, I think, tend to focus too much on the product itself was misguided near the end, I would say, especially at different time periods. But it was mainly, in my opinion, it was a merger between, it was the Time Warner merger with AOL, and that whole thing, I'm sure some people are probably familiar with it, was disaster off the get-go. AOL did not want anything to do with WCW, and they just shut it down. And then it enters a stage where legitimately Vince's vision is complete. Is this just the WWE, and that's it? And I mean, they still kept on putting on good shows for quite some time after that, but it becomes increasingly difficult to stay innovative and want to try new things when there's really not much incentive to, because you have no competition.
Now, to wrap us up today, and that will really feed into this next episode on The Wrestler that people should definitely listen to, is that the whole wrestling industry has a very, very dark underbelly of people being injured but still performing, people who've abused substance abuse, all sorts of really negative aspects to it. Maybe could you pick a couple of people who especially might inform people of what they'll come to expect with the wrestler film, because I think that movie really encapsulates a lot of the stories that some of these real professional wrestlers went through.
I guess the 80s wrestling boom, there was a famous family called the Von Erichs, and we talked about them earlier, and they were pretty much based in Texas. Their father ran the promotion WCCW. They all died tragic deaths, massive substance abuse problems. The one brother, he died. I've heard various stories. People say it was a hole in his intestine, and other people were saying, oh, he OD'd. There was another brother who had, I'm trying to remember his name now. He had massive cocaine addiction, steroid addiction. Not that steroids are addictive, but he was using heavily. He ended up losing his foot in a motorcycle accident. He could have maybe have kept it if he had listened to doctor's orders, but he walked on it too soon, re-injured it, and they had to amputate. And he actually wrestled with a fake foot for a long time. He ended up eventually killing himself. Basically, that entire family is completely tragic. And so I don't want to say it was all because of the wrestling, but it was definitely that lifestyle didn't help. Jake the Snake Roberts is another one. I'm pretty sure he's a pretty famous wrestler for your average fan. He was famous for walking out with the snake around his the giant snake around his neck. He became a hardcore alcoholic, too embarrassingly so. Drug addict, got really overweight. Probably most famously, he was working an indie show and he was so hammered he just puked all over the ring. People were really upset the promoters even let him go out there. He ended up getting better, but it's a really sad story. Probably the most famous one is Chris Benoit, and what happened to him, where he ended up murdering his family. And they later found out he had basically had the mind of I believe it was like 12-year-old, if I'm not mistaken, because of the amount of concussions that he had sustained during his career. He also was a heavy steroid abuser and drug abuser, painkillers in particular. But the undiagnosed concussions is, from my understanding, is what really made him lose his mind. Yeah, and he was famous for doing a move, the flying headbutt, which is the WWF, and I'll give them this: you're not allowed to do that move anymore because of the potential for issues with concussions. Almost a lot of these guys, it's pain pills that they end up getting addicted to, and leads to all different types of problems and undiagnosed concussions. And I'll give the WWF this: they've tried to do a better job in terms of diagnosing these issues and forcing these guys to take time off. A lot of these guys he does try to help, but yeah, I don't see the cycle ending, because it's the nature of the sport. It's brutal. It's a brutal sport. You're jumping off the top rope. You're constantly having to work through pain. There's really no way around it. These guys all know what they're signing up to when they get involved in this, and at least as we as audience members can do is appreciate what they're putting their bodies through, just so we can be entertained.